Excited to be speaking here at Housmans. Whenever I come to London, I'm always going through King's Cross because I live up in Sheffield, so I always make a point of coming around here to Housmans and seeing what's for sale. And it's just really great to be here to kind of talk about the book. So yeah, thank you very much for having me. What I'm going to do today is kind of mix up a few readings from the book, a few different stories that I've included in the ethnography, with a few different arguments that I make throughout the text. And these are the main arguments I kind of want to emphasise to you today. Firstly, that all squatters emphasise use over ownership, and that's a radical thing to emphasise. This is something that has a history to it, but it's also something that pushes back against the idea that there are distinct types of squatters. And I'm going to talk a bit more about why I think types and typologies are quite problematic. Secondly, that squatters, because they're non-owners, are rendered precarious because of their non-ownership status. But also, because they're beyond ownership, that means they have the potential to be more inclusive in these spaces. It's important that we emphasise the word potential there. Squats don't always work, crews don't always collaborate, they don't always it's not all smooth sailing. But what I'm arguing is that the potential is always there for these to be more inclusive spaces. And finally, that squats tell us something about the city, or in the case of this book, squats tell us something about London. They are windows onto property, they're windows onto what's going on in the city. Every time a squat occurs, the city is forced to reassert itself, whether that's through an eviction or stigmatisation, criminalisation. The city is forced to kind of say, like, oh no, we need to protect ownership of this empty building. So it tells us something about what's going on in the city today. So what I'm going to do is start with the vignette that opens the book. So this is in Newham in 2018. So we were already halfway across the road and the car had to brake pretty hard. The driver waved us on, but I wonder what he must have thought as he witnessed the struggle. At face value, I expect he just took pity on us. The shopping trolley had a dodgy wheel and a pile of large razor-sharp metal sheets laid across the top. They were flapping like giant silver wings on each side, and they shifted balance every time a wheel hit a curb or a pothole. It took a lot of concentration just to stop the whole lot from tipping over. Perhaps that anonymous driver in a shirt and a tie with a flashy German car was a landlord, I speculated. Perhaps he worked in real estate, an intermediary in London's vast financial sector, a bank or a law firm, and yet here he was giving way to materials destined to barricade a squat. That morning I'd met Oz at his new place. It was a long abandoned charity shop on Forest Gate High Street. The ground floor was typical for a squat. I don't know if you can really see that there. Bikes at various stages of repair, old sofas, office chairs, as well as other potentially useful items that had been liberated from skips and bins. Upstairs, the former offices had been repurposed as bedrooms, and as a bonus, there was even a working toilet. At the front, the squatter crew had somehow managed to get the shop shutter to work, and it came down just behind the entrance. However, this would not be enough to resist eviction, and judging by the banner that was hanging outside, they intended to take a very public stand against the bailiffs. So, squatting is a way to create space. It's a way to create space in a city that is, at best, indifferent to those without money to rent or own property. At its worst, London is a proactively violent city, unhoming and displacing communities through a property system that excludes, divides and denies people the spaces they need for housing or for community. For Oz, squatting is simply a direct response to that context. It's reclaiming space that is otherwise not being used and putting it to use. When something's been left to rot, even if you believe in private property to some degree, those kinds of spaces should be reclaimed and put back into community use and for the public good. So, London's squatting scene today is certainly not on the scale that it was in the 1970s, nor as public as it was between the 1980s and the introduction of new police powers in 2012. I was around before the law changed, said Oz, and most of the people who were heavily involved have since moved on. There's been a massive change in the scene. And yet cases of squatting keep cropping up and they keep igniting public debates around vacancy, ownership, housing crisis and entitlement in the city. There's a tendency to characterise squatters as either good, like genuinely in need of shelter, or bad, lazy layabouts, work shy, criminal, ideological. But for Oz, who was himself an experienced squatter, the situation on the ground was always much more complex than those stereotypes implied. The point is not good squatter, bad squatter. It's simply recognising that there are different circumstances. I think squatting is not one thing. It's not directly related to, say, anarchist principles, although there are a lot of people in the community that have those principles. The idea is reclaiming space is an attack on private property. It's not about good squat or bad squat. There are just some dickheads, and what can you do with them? Ozzy's crew was currently squatting unused buildings for community use. As part of an ethics of solidarity, squatting was a tool for them to create spaces, both for the local neighbourhood, but also for networks across the city. Having a public squat, however, meant announcing their presence, which could create potential problems. While a crew might be motivated to open up a space for community use, the presence of banners, graffiti, posters, or someone who looks like a squatter going in and out of the building was a signal to neighbours who might or might not be sympathetic, might invite police attention, or occasionally violence from far-right groups or landlords. I can't pretend that we resist evictions all the time, Oz explained. It really depends who you're living with and what kind of place you're in. You might be in a place with good people who simply don't want to draw attention to themselves. Squatting, at the end of the day, you can say every act of squatting is political because it's a reappropriation of land that was enclosed. But for some people, they're just getting a roof over their head, and that in itself is also important. If we're going to consider everyone, we can't be like, you need to be putting up a banner and fighting the police. So as Oz alludes to there, much is made about how there are different types of squatters. Every time there's been a movement to criminalise squatting, so in 1977, 1994 and 2011, 2012, these stereotypes get peddled again and again in the press and in political discourse. However, it's also worth pointing out that researchers, academics or non-academics who do research on squatting, also use typologies to help us understand squatting. One of the most cited academic articles on squatting is a typology of squatters, which makes distinctions between different types. It's also worth noting that squatters themselves can use types as well to differentiate themselves from other people. So they might say, well, the type of squatting that we're doing is different to the type of squatting they're doing. It might be better, it might be worse. But for me, I think these are problematic. Typologies can be mobilised to stigmatise people, they can marginalise people, and they can then lead to criminalisation down the line. I also think stereotypes can be quite reductive, so they don't really capture the overlap that happens between different crews, different buildings, even individuals when they're in different circumstances. They can also be hierarchical, as I just alluded to, saying that, well, our type of squatting is better than that type of squatting. But I think what I'm trying to argue in the book, beyond those kind of points, is also that typologies overlook context, and especially how that language, that stigmatising language that surrounds squatters, actually reflects wider property norms of who is entitled to space in the city, who deserves it, who's legitimate, who has authenticity, and who can own. So beyond those kind of typologies, what I argue in the book is that all squatters share in common the emphasis of use over ownership, and that we should define squatting as the trespass of empty properties, sure, motivated by an ongoing need for space, okay, but which justifies itself through use rather than ownership of that space. There's a historical precedent for recognising use in Anglo property law, whether those customary rights that were afforded to those on the fringes of forests and commons, or the legal precedent of adverse possession, where if you use a building or a piece of land for a certain amount of time, you can then apply for the title. Or even John Locke's notion that enclosure could be justified as long as it was put to higher and better use. But these principles of use over time have steadily been overtaken by ideas of ownership, and we can look at the push towards surveys, titles, registers, initially through colonial acquisition of land, and then through successive acts of parliament that enclosed land in the UK. But if you really think about it, ownership, or the idea that you can own something, is a fantasy. Because we can't have a direct relationship with something that we own. It's always a social relationship, one that's based on permission. You can use that thing that I claim to own, or exclusion. You need to stay out, you can't use the thing that I own. And yet the ownership model of property denies that fantasy, and it kind of says that actually we just need to defer to whoever the owner is on paper. So the authority of the owner to decide what counts as a legitimate use of a space is shut down by the idea that ownership is the ultimate way to kind of dole out space in the city. And the entitlement of the owner to do this goes unquestioned. Any disagreements over space are settled in advance. The aim of the formalisation of property through ownership is to tidy up property relations and actively restrict conflict over space. So in this way, the ownership model kind of tries to organise the world for us into owners and non-owners, and it calls upon the state in order to back that distinction up. But in contrast to that, squatting, because it's not deferring to ownership, holds open possibility for space. So it allows for agreement, also disagreement, it allows for negotiation and conflict, it allows for compromise, and it allows for division. Squatters make a localised claim to a space, which then has the potential to be more inclusive because it puts those social relations back on the table that are denied by ownership. Judgments of what counts as a legitimate activity in a space, or who counts as a legitimate user of a space, they're not predetermined in squats, because no one can claim formal exclusionary ownership over anyone else in that space. Squatters instead champion use over ownership, but with more flexibility around what counts as highest and best use. Instead, that balance of uses is constantly being reperformed, recontested, and therefore squats kind of embrace that messiness and chaos of social justice, which ownership is exactly designed to avoid. So when I set about researching this project between 2017 and 2020, and a little bit after the pandemic as well, I needed to find an approach that was going to embrace those nuances, those complexities, and the messiness of the way in which squatters were using space. The book's ethnographic, so there are kind of detailed observations of the everyday, the granular, the complex, and the contradictory. Not everyone in the book agrees with one another. There's also interviews in there and some archival work which contextualises that ethnographic side of it. And then for the first time, I actually used a method called photo elicitation interviews, where you hand out disposable cameras, people take pictures, and then you interview them about the pictures. And I found that to be quite an effective tool, because if you think about an interview situation, you're designing the questions that they provide the answers to. If you give them a camera and say, can you take a picture of the spaces that you're using and then come back and talk to me about it, it decenters me in that conversation. They can actually control that narrative more. The ethics, as you imagine, were quite difficult. I already knew a lot of squatters through previous work with Occupy London, so that was kind of my access to the scene. And I always attempted to introduce myself to as many people as possible, but it wasn't always practical. With the exception of public squats, so I'm thinking about art exhibitions, raves, squat parties, that kind of thing, I made an ethical decision to always wait for an invitation to a squatted space, which means I was counting on other people to vouch for me, like, that guy's okay, you can talk to him. But even this kind of raised issues. So sometimes I'd turn up to a squatted space I'd been invited to, but not everyone in that space knew who I was or what I was doing, and rightly challenged me at the door. But then what happened there was a negotiation about who could be in that space. So actually it kind of comes back to that idea of no one's an owner. No one can say that actually you can or cannot be in this space. It's always a negotiation and a compromise. And I'm happy to say that I was never kicked out, so that's good. Okay, so here's another example. This is a group that many of you might have heard of called Streets Kitchen, and this is in 2018. So whether through negotiation or the crowbar, Streets Kitchen find ways to access disused spaces for setting up refuges and solidarity hubs. By doing so, in the context of widespread homelessness and vacant buildings across London, they automatically politicise these spaces. In March 2018, facing the possibility of widespread deaths on the streets of London, they responded in characteristic fashion by squatting Sophia House, an empty commercial building on Great Portland Street. An unseasonal weather front dubbed the Beast from the East saw heavy snow and icy winds sweep across the UK. Temperatures in London struggled to climb above -14 degrees, prompting a red snow warning and a possible risk to life. And yet the response from local authorities was inconsistent and patchy. The idea behind the Severe Weather Emergency Protocol, or SWEP, is to coordinate a citywide response to provide shelters, and yet there always seems to be a reluctance to announce SWEP too early. A combination of public funding cuts, austerity, but also different political ideologies or empathies towards the homeless also means that the availability of shelters varies massively across London, from borough to borough. What's more, shelters simply aren't suitable for everybody. Some hate the feeling of being confined, some distrust the state and fear giving over their personal details, which might expose their whereabouts to family members or reveal their migration status in a hostile environment. The omnipresent St Mungo's had come under heavy criticism at the time for reporting people to the Home Office, whilst other bigger, more corporate charities are often seen as disempowering service users who have to play the part of a desperate victim to be considered a suitable candidate for support. This is why Streets Kitchen adopts the slogan, solidarity, not charity. So Sophia House, which was squatted during a snowstorm, stood in clear contrast to the cold and inhospitable streets but also the half-hearted, slow and alienating response of the state and the third sector. By just doing it, squatters make the question of how we match homeless people and peopleless homes simple, and their occupation clearly demonstrated the contradictions of space in London. Yale, who was my interviewee, argued, "You've got people sleeping outside empty buildings, and this is ridiculous. People should be in those buildings, even if it was only temporary. The perspective I'm coming from is to end rough sleeping overnight. Once we have those people in a safe space, we can work with them, and we can provide support services around it, but the primary thing we need is buildings. The buildings are there, we need councillors to take responsibility and work with us. Through Sophia House, we proved it can be done." So I first visited Sophia House on the day that they received an eviction order. None of the windows on the ground floor opened, and the only door, which was regularly kind of being opened and closed by a steady flow of people, was mostly being kept shut to retain heat and for security. The smell of cigarettes, cooking, and the stale musk of hundreds of bodies that had slept there for weeks hung in the air, but it was warm. Some people were sleeping in rows, other people sat watching TV, chatting, or stood by the kitchen with a cup of tea and eyeing up the donated food, which was spread out for anyone to help themselves. To the left there were rails of free clothes, an information stall, and a few copies of the Squatter's Handbook. Yale had a bit of a reputation for being determined and hardcore, and when I found him, he was being accosted from all sides. Some of the people staying in the squat were understandably anxious about the eviction notice. They wanted to know what was going to happen. All around the room, people had begun to pack their belongings with a sense of inevitability. There were also volunteers, journalists, researchers, students, all trying to grab a minute with Yale to ask him questions. So when I finally got my chance, I quickly introduced myself as a researcher before asking whether there was anything I could do to help. Rightly fed up, he snapped back, "If you want to help, get a crowbar and open another fucking building." I think Sophia House demonstrated the possibility of property relations of inclusion and care, even if this was challenging at times. Yet that impending eviction and the constant media scrutiny was a constant reminder of how the wider dominance of ownership would ultimately render this space precarious and temporary. Yale argued, you can't really read it there, but you can develop a sustainable community. You can develop somewhere where people can share skills. You can create life-changing spaces, believe it or not. But there are some negatives to squatting because of the nature of it. The perpetual moving leads to mental health issues. Generally, you're not keeping a squat for more than 3 weeks. And that in itself creates problems because you're always ready to move. You're always on the move again. And yet, as a literal port in a storm, Sophia House demonstrates how squatting is a quick and efficient way to open up wasted spaces. And Yale's take on the future of squatting was defiantly optimistic. I see squatting as a solution to the housing crisis. It gave myself somewhere to live and a base for setting up operations. I mean, that's where Street's Kitchen came out of. We came out of the squatting movement. For me, squatting done properly is a solution to the housing crisis and to community value, giving space for marginalised groups to meet to do whatever they need to do. So there's a series of overlapping contexts which render squatting and squatters precarious. So we might point to, example, the housing crisis. According to the last census, there's 1.3 million truly vacant homes across England, which is enough for every homeless person to have a second home. The coexistence of peopleless homes and homeless people is a direct consequence of a system that prioritises ownership over use. The housing market is also responsible not only for the abundance of empty buildings, but also for their material conditions, as empty buildings are left to rot as part of speculative and warehousing behaviour. But another context we might point to is the context of austerity or austerity urbanism. With the loss of a social safety net, what I found is a lot of squats were catching people that were falling through services and couldn't find support anywhere else. And one of the phrases that kept coming up is that squats provide a social safety net below the safety. So I met people who had been discharged from hospital early, needed to be located in London in a particular place so they could access clinics or so they could access medication or they could get the support that they needed. So squatting was a kind of way to kind of support people who were being let down everywhere else. I think it's also worth mentioning here the hostile environment. So I met people in the squatting scene who, rather than sleep rough or sleep in a deportation centre while they were waiting for their asylum application to go through, elected to squat instead, and crews supported them through that process. But really what ties all of those themes together is the social norms of property. Because they're non-owners, they're stigmatised, they're criminalised, and they're not considered to be legitimate citizens bearing authentic voice. It's also worth pointing out that non-owners are weaponised as part of kind of ideological shifts to protect property and to justify ownership even of empty buildings. But despite these overlapping structures making squatting more difficult and precarious, it's of course also those circumstances that make it absolutely necessary. And so here's an example from Denmark Hill. And this is also an example of the photo-elicitation photos that I was getting. This is the front of the squat. So Wanda had taken a photo of a sheet of Cytex, which was bent upwards to let the light in through the window. You could just transform the whole place. Her eyes gleamed. Instead of it looking haunted and abandoned, it could be thriving. All of that sheeting has come off now. It looks less squatty and more inviting for the community. The front's been cleaned up a lot. Located down a leafy road of large detached houses on Denmark Hill, keeping up appearances was important to maintain a good relationship with the neighbours. The squat itself was a former nursing home. Wanda had been living there for a while and was trying to create some sort of community engagement with the space, but was finding it difficult to organise support from a constantly rotating crew of people. Out the back, she wanted to open up the garden and a small wooded area to the public, which, according to rumour, was the location of the legendary Camber Well and its healing waters. Through the trees at the back, we could also see the glistening towers of the City of London and the Shard. As we went back into the house, we passed a ginger cat that was sleeping on a chair in the hallway. He is the original squatter, Wanda explained. I think you always need cats in squats because of the mice and rats situation. It helps things out a lot. Last night we didn't sleep and it's a problem. When you start to hear the rats running around or the mice or whatever, it takes away that homely feeling that you've created in a space. And it doesn't matter how clean it is, it starts to take away the idea of it being clean, safe to sleep in, safe to leave your food in. Wanda was one of only 2 women at Denmark Hill. I felt that much of the domestic labour of maintaining that space was falling on her shoulders. I remember when we first moved in, it was expected that I would clean the kitchen every day after food, but I was also helping to make the food. Guys in general don't like to do the washing up or the cleaning. It gets a bit frustrating, so I just stopped doing it. It was brought up in a meeting that everyone needs to take responsibility and clean up after themselves, but depending on how much of a rush you're in, how high you are, how tired you are, it doesn't always happen. The kitchen can be the microcosm of the overall viability of a living space. As well as being essential in terms of those in the building staying fed and healthy, communal meals also act as a social glue that hold people together. Wanda told me that while she didn't really mind taking on that extra workload, she decided it was best to stop stressing about it. But with the breakdown of the kitchen came a loss of communal care and mutual solidarity. In the end, she explained, we regressed to our room and we just keep food in the room. When I stopped using the kitchen, the whole community broke down. If I wasn't around to help with the peeling, chopping, cooking and cleaning, it just wasn't happening. But it just seemed like when I decided not to do that, it was my fault that the community then broke down. No one was having communal once-a-day meals together and discussing things. While some of the more reflexive male squatters did recognise what was going on and were attempting to step up, it's fair to say that they simply didn't experience the gendered structure of the space in the same way as Wanda, who began to feel personally responsible that the community within the building had collapsed. Property divisions within the space then started to be expressed materially. Individuals began to isolate themselves to rooms or even attempted to make ownership claims over certain spaces, such as, I clean this kitchen more, therefore I should be able to use it more than everyone else. Wanda was quick to add, however, that many of the people who had moved into the squat were themselves dealing with trauma and the challenges of marginality, so she was quite sympathetic to the idea that not everyone might be ready to live communally, let alone participate in a public-facing project. Maybe we can help them integrate into a healthier lifestyle, she sighed, but not everyone's ready, and you keep your distance in a respectful way. From an ethical and political standpoint, the disposition of squatters, who themselves have no formal ownership over the space, tends to be to avoid excluding people. However, practically, that isn't always conducive to maintaining a safe and secure home. Wanda had one unusual story which had directly confronted their right to use the space, not only in the building, but one of the bedrooms. So there was a situation where a girl came late one night and said, I used to live here and I've been travelling. I've just come back. I don't know what the situation is, but I need a night to sleep. And then the next morning I left, and when I got back, she was in my room. I said, hi, who are you? It took half an hour to talk her out of the room because I felt defensive, naturally, from the way she was being, saying that this was her room and she had every right to stay and sleep there. However, after initially feeling threatened by the stranger, Wanda actually managed to avoid resorting to simply asserting her own use of the space, and instead decided to negotiate by helping her find another space within the building. She said she needed a place to recharge over the next few days, and I thought that was fair. So I said, "I'll help you find a space." I put a bed in the corridor, I put some cloths up around it. She started to calm down and be less aggressive. I just had some empathy towards her situation. I don't think she had money to stay anywhere else. Others in the squat, however, were less sympathetic, so one person argued that the stranger had been aggressive towards him, while another claimed that she was lying about living there before, and therefore she needed to go. Wanda stood up for the stranger, but the whole episode had shaken her confidence of the space. I asked her, "Is that when you put a lock on the bedroom door?" And she said, "Yeah, that was it really. Before then we didn't feel like we needed to." So I think it's fair to say that some squats are more inclusive than others, and that can depend on a host of different factors. It can just simply be a mix of personalities, or those from marginalised backgrounds with specific needs, such as individuals dealing with health issues or dealing with traumatic pasts. But I think another thing that needs to be recognised is that since the change in the law in 2012, which mostly criminalised the squatting of residential buildings, squatters have been forced to squat larger buildings, warehouses, office blocks, that kind of thing. And this means bigger crews to hold that building down, which means more people to fall out with. You can also have different aspirations for the ongoing use of the space. So there were some squatters I interviewed that were part of crews, and their way of dealing with conflict was basically to burn through the building. So as soon as the building, living inside that building became untenable, just move on to the next one. And they just kept doing that. Whereas other crews tried to kind of have meetings or tried to kind of find compromises between different competing uses of that space. In the book, I argue that these kind of negotiations of space are a microcosm around who has a right to be in the city as a whole. Without that exclusionary authority of ownership, there is a potential in these spaces to generate alternative belongings, new bonds of care, trust, solidarity, and skill sharing. People can be permitted to have aspirations, different aspirations, for even the same space, even if this can be messy and difficult in practice. This isn't a messiness that's automatically shut down by deferring to an owner as to what that space can be used for. Okay, this is where I check in with you guys. Would you like to hear another final story from the book? Okay, great. So this is a group called Temporary Autonomous Art. It was the day before Temporary Autonomous Art 2018, and I was following the map on my phone from Charlton Station, down the hill, over 2 main roads, past an enormous supermarket distribution centre and an industrial estate. Having been evicted from their first building, which was a former National Grid depot in Bow, the backup building was a former headquarters of the bookmakers E. Coombs Limited. They had been subsumed by a larger company in 2011, and this office block had been unused ever since, vacantly overlooking the Thames Barrier, those 10 steel gates that protect London from being overcome by a rising tide. I had arranged to meet Quinn at the gate, and she pushed it just wide enough for me to duck under the padlock chain. The corridors and the stairwells inside were already full of people painting and stenciling. On each floor, what had previously been rows of dusty offices were being transformed into art installations, as well as spaces for talks, screenings, performances, and a bar. On the roof, there were more artists hard at work. It was pretty amazing to be on the side of the Thames like that, Quinn reflected later. Probably in a few years, that's just going to be high-rise flats or something, no doubt. I think it was just funny to be on the roof where you could see all of this. When I go to those parts of the city, such as Canary Wharf, it just feels really weird and pristine and soulless. And obviously it's all about money. It's just like the city is centred around them, and there's no place for other people to have their dreams happen as well. It's just like the only way you can survive in London, or the only way they want you to survive, is to play into this wider thing of the bankers and the city workers, the creative elites. Everyone else should just work in the service industry. So the crew had arrived in the early hours of the morning, and they'd started cleaning straight away because they were buzzing off the adrenaline. There had been some disagreement, however, about whether they could actually use this new building. Most of the block was clearly abandoned, stacks of old computers, pictures from horse races and ancient betting machines. But shortly after getting inside, they found an office which still had signs of being used, including a laptop and a fridge which had food in it that was still in date. So there was a discussion about whether they should try and find a third building. But in the end, they agreed to simply seal off that room and attempt to protect the belongings within it. There were micro-negotiations of space happening all over the building. The biggest room had been claimed early on for the bands and for the cabaret stage, whilst in the former boardroom, there was a collective busy pasting anti-royalist artwork on the walls. There was also an expensive-looking oil painting in the boardroom, which one of the squatters had argued should have been locked away as well. Quinn said, for some reason, which is weird, they felt that this portrait was important and that we shouldn't touch it. But I think what they did was great, to be honest, because that's the whole point. The whole point of the boardroom is it's meant to be intimidating. So I think it's great that they flipped the power and said, fuck this. I think it's great they said fuck off to the person trying to protect it. Throughout the building, there's no system of allocation as to which spaces people could use to display their artwork. And there's no formal selection process as to who can or cannot participate in temporary autonomous art. The idea is that there's no curation. It's literally first come, first served. No one controls what's considered to be acceptable. The point is to open an empty building as a blank canvas for creativity and experimentation. The organisers and artists at TAA treasure the spontaneity, the flexibility and the freedom from ownership in more formal galleries which might carry fees or kind of taste judgments. But Quinn was also keen to emphasise that no limits is not the same as anything goes. This is a quote from Quinn. You can literally do anything as long as it's not oppressive. You couldn't do like blackface or something that was oppressive to marginalised groups. That's not acceptable. You're creating this free space, but it's not actually free because although it's non-curated, you are to some extent controlling it as much as you can. Controlling it autonomously, which is a complete contradiction in terms. You've got the people who spent months thinking about it and trying to put things in place for it. They have a vision to some extent, and complete autonomy is impossible. Something that was particularly frowned upon at TAA was tagging, so spray painting a name or a symbol over an artwork and effectively defacing someone else's work. When I asked her about it, Quinn rolled her eyes. I'm not against tagging, it's just annoying when someone has spent 10 hours making a mural and then someone scribbles over it. I think on private property, I don't give a fuck. But when it's autonomous space, it's good to consider other people. At TAA in 2018, property relations spilled out onto the street when someone decided to tag a car which had been parked on the road outside. As it turned out, the vehicle belonged to a pub landlord next door who soon rang the police. After the squatters convinced the police that they were not holding a rave and that they would be gone by the end of the weekend, they left them alone. But the landlord was frustrated and came over with a gang to sort out the squatters themselves. And some of the squatters found themselves on the front line at the gate, literally fighting them off. Yeah, the pub landlord came over with some of his mates and we had a fight. We had to fight them off at the gate. We didn't really have the personnel and basically I had to get up there and go at these fatties. Like, my nose is all crunchy in different bits, but I think we did fight them off. After the fight, Quinn told me that there were some arguments around whether this was an appropriate location for TAA. And some people began to leave after threats from the landlord that that gang might return. People were like, oh, I haven't moved the slide on. Oh, it's not up there, sorry. People were like, oh, we shouldn't have gone to a working class area. But it's like the people in the pub, they did fascist threats against us. They mentioned the Football Alliance. And it's like, fuck them, I don't give a fuck. On the Sunday, they were like, there's 5,000 people we can get down here now. They mentioned there was a Tommy Robinson march happening. And at that point I thought, well, I genuinely don't give a fuck that your car got tagged. Let's go do it again. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up now with some of the main arguments from the book. Through their actions, squatters force us to rethink property and the city. By intervening into the city and materially reshaping these spaces, squats push us to interrogate the urban. Why are there so many vacancies when people can't access the spaces they need? Who can live, belong, or participate in a city, and who gets to decide? Who are we, and what is our vision for change? And where are the spaces that permit imagination, creativity, and experimentation? If trespass is a window onto property, then squats are a window onto the city. They reveal the distribution of space as it really is, and they challenge preconceived ideas around entitlement, who can use space for what purposes. They put use before ownership, and therefore they're rendered precarious. They're an outcome of an exclusive city, of a wasteful ownership model that would rather privilege the owner of a vacant and empty wasted property than its potential uses. So this book is an account, like just an account, of the ambitions and struggles of London squatters. Squatters, I think, are an example of people just using their city. Where the state or the market fail to offer the spaces that people need, there's 1 billion squatters around the world who are taking the initiative. The city's already happening, whether you planned it to or not, whether you intended it to or not. And yet the reaction, which is shaped by European and colonial epistemologies, is to try and formalise or criminalise anything that's unpermitted or unsanctioned or uncontrolled. So instead, could we look at cities like London and other cities from the margins and reimagine the urban? Could it be possible for communities to negotiate and generate their own spaces? After all, in London's empty buildings, behind boarded up windows and doors, with crowbar bent corners, a simple idea is being kept alive. The spaces we need are already all around us. So the book's out now, and it's for sale in the shop at a discount. So please grab a copy and look forward to hearing what you think. Thank you very much.